Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. For those of you that I don't yet know, I'm Chris Miller, one of the co-directors of the Russia and Eurasia program and assistant professor here at the Fletcher School. And we're very excited to see such a big crowd and hopefully an active crowd for a talk by a very distinguished guest and hopefully some interesting question and answers after that. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to our guest, Jake Sullivan, who's a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School among many other affiliations. And is perhaps most famous for being a foreign policy advisor to Hillary Clinton. And hopefully we can talk a bit about some of his experience in that, and also looking forward at American foreign policy in a period of great change and great uncertainty. So Jake, with that very short introduction, the floor is yours, and we're interested to hear what you have to say.
Great, thank you. So do you guys mind if I take this thing down, or is that okay?
Go for it.
Can I put it? All right. That's how I start all my lectures. I just find something to move. First of all, thank you for having me here, and to all of you for coming out on a crisp fall afternoon. I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes or so, hopefully in a relatively informal way, about a really big question, which is really sort of naturally, it turns into three questions. Can America still lead the world? Should it? And if so, how? I think we have to touch on all of those. I'm not going to do that in a methodical way. I'll just sort of reflect on where I think we are and some of the ways in which Trump has challenged fundamental assumptions of American foreign policy, and then come on to some of my views about where I think we need to go. So if you worked in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, any of the presidents after the end of the Cold War, you pretty much took for granted as a starting assumption that the United States was going to be the global leader, and also that sustaining that leadership was in a sense one of the core objectives of foreign policy, safeguarding and protecting America's position in the world. And it wasn't even like you really thought this through in a particularly conscious way. That was just sort of baked into the laws of physics of foreign policy within those administrations, and that covered the period that I was in government, 4 years at the State Department with Secretary Clinton, and 2 years at the White House as the National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden and a Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. And also during those three administrations, if you sat in the Situation Room or you sat at Foggy Bottom, you thought of the U.S. as the constant in the world and as everything else as the variable that you had to deal with. Now that's changed pretty dramatically. Now the ultimate variable in global affairs today is the United States of America, the most disruptive force right now, because of the way that Donald Trump is changing the approach that the U.S. is taking in foreign policy. And so the question of whether the United States can still lead, whether it should, is very much up for grabs. And not just up for grabs by Donald Trump, but I think has to be up for grabs for anybody who works on U.S. foreign policy, either from the perspective of an American or anyone who observes U.S. foreign policy from the perspective of someone from somewhere else around the world. And it's not just because Trump's come onto the scene and kind of gone at the core premises of American foreign policy. It's also because of a host of other changes. The rise of China, the broader change in the distribution of power among states, the diffusion of power away from states, the challenges of governance, and the rise of division and instability within states, and not just fragile and failing states, but actually within the West as well. And these mega driver trends like climate and technology and migration. There's a lot going on right now that all continue to raise the question about whether A, the system itself can endure, and B, whether the United States can remain a central part of it. So when people of my ilk, folks who've worked in foreign policy over the last three administrations, are asked this question, they tend to start by talking about the liberal international order. And I was on the campaign trail in 2016. I was Hillary Clinton's policy director for the 2016 campaign. And I used this phrase, liberal international order, at a campaign event in Ohio. And a gentleman came up to me afterwards and said, I don't know what that is, but I don't like any of those three words, which made me realize I shouldn't keep using that in foreign policy. I mean, in political circles. And in fact, it exposed for me the kind of poverty of the idea of liberal international order more generally, because it's a term that's just so ill-defined and it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. The other thing that people tend to say in answer to this question, beyond talking about the fate and future of the liberal international order, is to revert to something that used to be the kind of common phrase that was used about American leadership in the world. That is, we're the indispensable nation. This idea of indispensability. And what I also found on the campaign trail in 2016 is that a lot of people in the United States heard indispensable and thought, that sounds pretty tiring, not particularly energizing. It's like the boy from the Hans Brinker story who sticks his finger in the dike to hold back the water. And if that's what indispensability is, I don't want any part of it. Oh, and by the way, this was sort of the reaction I got to this kind of argument. You're indispensable to somebody else, not to yourself. So necessarily, the idea of being the indispensable nation is somehow not about your national interest. It's about some other interest. And this is why Trump's America First argument, I think, got so much purchase, because people really did believe that the rest of us working in American foreign policy had something else first and not America. I'd like to believe President Obama and President Bush and President Clinton all put America first as well, but somehow there was a sense that the thrust and purpose of American foreign policy wasn't fundamentally about America's national interest. So 25 years after the end of the Cold War, more now, it's 27 years really after the end of the Cold War, 29 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we really haven't answered the question, what is American foreign policy for those of us who work in American foreign policy? We haven't had that answer. Liberal international order doesn't get it done. Indispensability doesn't get it done. And I guess what I want to posit to all of you today is to say that for any country, anywhere in the world, foreign policy is fundamentally about protecting and defending the way of life of that country. And if you're sitting in the United States right now, there are two basic categories of threats to the American way of life. There are those threats that are coming from within our society that are challenging the idea of what it means to be America, our institutions, some of the kind of founding premises of our country, and there are the threats that come from without. And the foreign policy aspect of this is dealing with those threats from without. And the thing about those threats from without is they too fall into two basic categories. One, the threats from states. And what you were seeing from Bernie Sanders all the way across to neoconservative thinkers like Bob Kagan is a growing argument in the US that the threats from states are fundamentally threats about pressure on the open democratic model of the West, what Bernie Sanders calls the axis of authoritarianism, what Tom Wright says is an effort by Russia and China in particular to try to make the world safe for authoritarianism. This is a growing argument in the foreign policy community about the kind of threat being posed as we've seen the return of geopolitical competition. But then there's a larger set of threats that transcend states, that cross borders, that have the potential to have a dramatic impact on our way of life and the way of life of people everywhere. And I can think of a few of them. Climate change, the possibility of weapons of mass destruction either falling into the hands of terrorist groups or otherwise being used. Cyber attacks that are catastrophic in nature. Pandemic disease that sweeps across countries and continents and causes mass death along the way. And then the potential for another global financial crisis that could go from being a Great Recession into a worldwide Great Depression. I think that's pretty much the list. Maybe you guys could add to it. But here's the rub about those things that I just listed. None of them can be solved by one country acting alone. And if the United States is not playing a central role in mobilizing cooperation, it is hard to see how effective global common responses get created. It is hard to see how someone else can do it. So my kind of early answer to the should question, should America still seek to play a leadership role, is yes. And the reason it's yes is because cooperation to solve that span of problems does not happen by spontaneous combustion. It doesn't happen because the UN calls a meeting. It happens because an actor a country with sufficient power and leverage actually gathers the relevant decision makers in a room from around the globe and drives results. That was true with the Paris Climate Agreement, where but for American leadership, which is ironic to say now since we've also pulled out of it, you wouldn't have a Paris Climate Agreement. Now, I would say in that case, it required the US and China to work together, but China wasn't going to lead that effort. That had to be the United States driving the agenda to produce the outcome. The same thing with the Ebola outbreak that occurred in 2015, which first looked like it might sweep across 3 countries of West Africa and then beyond, and was contained largely because the United States mobilized a global common response. As much as the US was responsible for the global financial crisis in 2007, it was the US creating and hosting the first G20 that produced the architecture of cooperation that led the world to come together to stop it from spilling over into becoming a worldwide Great Depression. So in the absence of another actor who is prepared to step in to serve this role, and believing as I do that it doesn't happen without an actor, I would say that the United States, for its own selfish national interest reasons, as well as for its contribution to the larger common interest, has to think very seriously about continuing to seek to play this leadership role. And the question is then, is this really possible? Well, it takes a certain kind of actor to be able to continue to do this, a certain kind of mindset and the deployment of certain capacities of power and influence, persuasion, and so forth. And what Donald Trump has basically done is he's come along and attacked 4 key premises of American foreign policy, without which the possibility of the US continuing to serve in this role will be dramatically reduced and weakened. So the first is, he's basically said, I don't believe in alliances. I think alliances have screwed over the United States. And if I were to sum up what his view is, it's Lord Palmerston's old adage that nations don't have permanent friends, just permanent interests. And therefore, what is this deal with us having these European countries and these Asian countries as our allies? They're just there to free ride off us. And this has been a long-standing view of Donald Trump's, going back to the 1980s, when in the Reagan administration, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, we're getting screwed by the Japanese, among others. So this is something he's come by, honestly, and over a very long time. Now, as with most things with Donald Trump, in my view, and I'm just giving my own personal perspective, he's on to something at some level that actually America's alliances in 2018, alliances designed in the 1940s and 50s to be able to push back against a Soviet threat, have yet to find their purpose any more than American foreign policy has been able to find its purpose. And yet the answer, in my view, is not to blow up those alliances, but to refashion them around a different set of priorities. And what I would offer to you today is an argument which says both NATO and our major Asian alliances, in particular Japan, Korea, and Australia, should be very much focused on not just the geopolitical competition in their respective regions, but what I call the 4 Cs. Cyber, where we have not set up an alliance structure to be able to effectively deal with this entirely new domain of conflict. Counter-propaganda, and the entire use of public diplomacy and propaganda and information operations for all manner of purposes, not just election interference, but other things as well. Corruption, I think the Western alliance system has to think very hard about the use of corruption as a foreign policy tool, seeking to achieve ends by state-dominated economies. And counterterrorism. That's the one where we've probably had the most advanced impact so far, but even so, when you go to NATO right now and you sit around the table, it is a lot of old school discussion that is neither relevant to the continuing Russian threat, and that core threat has to be still the core of the alliance, nor relevant to any of these new things. It just kind of is moving along under its own weight and own momentum. And so my argument is Trump is right to question the value of alliances today. He's right to say that they could at some point be obsolete if we do not update them and direct them towards meaningful threats till now. But he is wrong to then want to throw them out the window because they remain an enormously important asset and stabilizing factor, and that would be my argument for what to do about them. So then the second sort of core premise of American foreign policy that Trump has attacked is the idea of some form of positive sum logic. The logic that says the United States is better, safer, and stronger when other countries are better, safer, and stronger. Trump basically says, if you were to sum up his foreign policy in just a few words, it'd be they're laughing at us. They're screwing us over. It's a sucker's game. We're bearing all the burdens, others are reaping all the benefits, and that's got to stop. And this is where, you know, back to the alliances point, he comes on to people paying up, paying their fair share. It's where on trade he comes to the idea that other countries are getting a margin off the United States and we're going to compress that margin, by God, because they're no longer going to rip us off. And oh, by the way, we're no longer participating in the multilateral system because the entire multilateral system was designed, as I'll get onto in my next point, to really shackle and hold down the United States. So here again, similarly, Trump is onto something in that at a time when more countries have more capacity to contribute to global problem solving, they should be given more voice and scope in doing so, and also be allocated more responsibility to do so as well. And if you worked in the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the way it kind of went when anything happened anywhere in the world was the Americans would say, what are we going to do about that? And the rest of the world would say, this was sort of a rule of thumb, what are the Americans going to go do about that? Now that's a little rough and a little crude, but was really my experience in government, from natural disasters to the outbreak of civil wars and everything in between. That mindset is changing in the rest of the world and needs to change in American foreign policy as well, and we have to find a way, rather than to absorb burdens or think about ourselves as responsible for distributing to them, to having a system where burdens are spread more evenly in a meaningful sense, not just who pays 2% into NATO, but who has what capacity to help solve which problem in which way. And American leadership necessarily has to change to be less directive and more consultative, more based in partnership, more based in giving up certain amounts of power and decision-making and influence as we go forward. That would be a real vision of positive sum burden sharing in the years ahead. And I think on the list of catastrophic threats I listed at the beginning, you could think about whether it's Europe or China or Japan or emerging nations in Latin America or Africa, for different ones of those challenges, stepping up to take on larger responsibilities, and for American leadership to be adjusted in concept, to be about encouraging and facilitating that, as opposed to saying, no, we're the chairman of the board, we're sitting at the head of the table, we call all the shots. But this is a different idea of burden sharing than what I think is the very narrow, stingy version that we've heard from Donald Trump. So that brings us to the third major premise, which I sort of referred to in reference to the multilateral system, which is Donald Trump basically believes that all relationships in global affairs should be bilateral. No more multilateral engagement of any kind, in his ideal view. No more multilateral trade deals, no more multilateral climate agreements, no more multilateral peacekeeping contributions. Let's go country, and by the way, it goes beyond, multilateralism the US participates in. It also means no more European Union. Indeed, Donald Trump just said a couple of days ago, the European Union was created to screw over the United States. That was its founding purpose. Never mind that the US helped stand it up. I guess that's why he says all of our past leaders were stupid. But who does that sound like? What's so interesting about Trump's view on this is it's almost identical to Vladimir Putin's. And by the way, to a certain extent, Xi Jinping's. When you're a big country and a number of smaller countries, still significant and sizable countries, but smaller countries band together in a union, you think, well, my power and leverage has been reduced vis-a-vis this group of countries. That's how Russia has seen both NATO and the European Union and has a strategy to try and undermine that. It's how China has seen ASEAN's efforts to negotiate on the South China Sea, for example. Nope, we want to do this bilaterally, says the Chinese leadership. to have the American president basically taking the same view of the same institutions, it's quite dramatic, quite striking, and I think very problematic. So, and now I think that's part, just as an aside, I think part of it is about this negotiation leverage point, we're the biggest, so why would we want smaller countries banding together? Part of his objection to the EU, honestly, is I think he sees European small d Democrats and thinks they are American big D Democrats, because they are these people who whine at him about progressive things like climate change and refugees and the like, and I think he looks at Angela Merkel and sees Nancy Pelosi, honestly. And so he's like, I don't like those people. So I think that's at least a part of what is motivating him on this, beyond the narrow bilateralism and multilateralism issue. But where does that leave us? Because I think where he's not wrong to a significant extent is that aspects of the current multilateral system aren't working. And we do have to revisit them. We have to take a hard look at them. And I would argue to all of you that the WTO, as it stands right now, is not dealing with some of the largest challenges to the global economic order. It just was designed at a time when many of these were not really in the offing, whether you're talking about state-owned enterprises or intellectual property or currency, or for that matter, tax avoidance, which is very difficult to talk about trade today without talking about the fact that the gains from trade, which are then supposed to be redistributed to the losers, are actually being captured and moved offshore to the Cayman Islands or wherever. And so these ideas of Kaldor-Hicks efficiency just don't apply anymore. And you can go down the list and see the range of issues that just aren't covered under the WTO, and the Doha round has shown that the institution can't really move forward. Now, my argument would not be Donald Trump's argument, which is let's just get rid of the WTO. But my argument would be to have a like-minded effort of like-minded states try to set high standards across each of those areas. Now, that might sound familiar to some of you. That sounds a lot like the logic that was used for TPP. But I would say TPP is not sufficient. That what we need to do instead is add a trans-Pacific trade agreement to a transatlantic trade agreement where you get 2/3 of the world economy into a single high standard agreement that is open platform, that would invite the Chinese in if they chose to participate, as well as any other country that wanted to, but that would in fact try to drive new high standards across this whole range of activities. I think A, that would address some of the political challenges in the United States because it would take us beyond just the TPP fight. It would make the problem larger as opposed to smaller or walk away from it. And I think B, it actually would put us in a better position to have not a trade war with China, but rather a mature adult trade conversation about what the nature of the global economy is going to have to look like going forward and what fundamental reforms the Chinese would have to undertake in order to be full participants in that economy. So happy to talk further about that, but there again, you know, in keeping with my theme, I really believe that Trump is there's a kernel of truth, I guess is the way I would put it, on the cob of nonsense that we get from Trump on a lot of these issues. So the fourth area where Trump has basically said enough of what the standard bipartisan foundation has been is values, is the role of values in U.S. foreign policy. And what he basically argues is, I like authoritarians, I'm comfortable with them, they're predictable, I sort of want to be like them. And even as we're just watching unfold with the Khashoggi case right now, essentially you have an administration that has decided this is not going to be a relevant factor. Now we can debate the extent to which values have played a central role in U.S. foreign policy, but my argument to you would be that any American who previously said, we stand by our values at all times in U.S. foreign policy was obvious. You know, we could demolish that argument in 30 seconds. Just throw out names of countries that we dealt with over the last 70 years who were anything but democratic, things that we participated in that were contrary to our values. But just an anecdote which captures where I think the U.S. should move on this question to a more humble, more consistent place, is to think about the role of democracy, human rights, and values in American decision-making as being one factor among many, that does not always win, but that is sincerely present, and that is rare and impressive enough. And the anecdote is that I was meeting with a group of Bahraini human rights activists during the Arab revolutions, while there was unrest on the streets of Bahrain. And I started the meeting by saying to them, the US strongly stands for democratic reform and human rights in Bahrain. And they said, great, so pull the Fifth Fleet out of Manama and stick it to the government until they give us our rights. And I said, well, we can't do that, but we stand with you. Don't worry, we absolutely stand with you. It is a paramount priority of the United States. And they sort of looked at me and were like, okay, this is BS and I can't really take this seriously. And finally, I had a moment where I said, look, I'm gonna be completely honest with you. We do care. We do genuinely care. We are not neutral on the issue of democratic reform and human rights in Bahrain. And there are active conversations going about what tools we have to bring to bear to help you out. But we also have interests with your government, in your country, in your region. That's real too. So let's have an honest conversation about what we can actually do to help you, given the constraints we're under. Okay, let's just be real with each other. And one of the guys stood up and came over and gave me a hug, because he basically said, thank you. Okay, now we can have a legitimate conversation, because the US is not repudiating or saying no, values don't matter to us, we're all power politics all the time. And I would happily debate anyone who wants to stand for that proposition. That no, this is all BS, because it's not. I've been in too many meetings involving too many of these issues to buy that. But I think saying that this is one consideration among a range of considerations, and we do what we can on it where we can, and we fall short and we screw up and we overreach. If we could get to a more consistent place on that, in my view, we would be in a better position when someone like Trump comes along to not just say, oh my God, what are you doing? Because for us to criticize Trump right now about Saudi Arabia, probably leave a lot of people saying like, hello, where have you been for the last umpteen years? And I recognize that. And I think taking a more honest accounting of where we have been and where we need to go on the question of democracy and values is going to be very important if the US wants to think about maintaining a leadership role. So I believe that across those four dimensions, those four pillars, recognizing the adjustments that we need to make in response to the challenge of Trump, but also all of these other global trends and factors that I've talked about today, is how the United States can restore, reclaim a leadership role, but a leadership role that is modified and adjusted for the different international landscape and the nature of the challenges that we face today. And I think it's also how we will best deal with the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the prevalence today of geopolitical competition and power politics between the major players in the world. And I will just finish with a comment that I would sort of compare Donald Trump and the way that he has dealt with US foreign policy to being like a hurricane who's swept through and demolished some of the core kind of institutions and infrastructure of US foreign policy. And in the post-Trump era, whether that's in 2 years or in 6 years, I think there's a big difference whether it's 2 or 6, by the way, which we can talk about. That the way mayors talk about rebuilding their cities after hurricanes have come through is not just to build the infrastructure back the way it was before, but to build better, to build different, to build for the future, to say, okay, now we get to take stock of what worked, what didn't, what was missing, what was unnecessary, and we can build a different, newer, fresher infrastructure for the future. And I think more than anything else, for me, that's what this opportunity provides us. That has been the spirit of the talk that I've offered today, and that's what I hope to do, is to be part of an effort to build better, and hope that many of you in this room will participate in that. And that is not an American project, by the way. That is a project for people from all over the world to think about the infrastructure and architecture of global cooperation on these major challenges that could potentially afflict all of us. And we all have this opportunity, and not just because of Trump, but because of the hurricane of disruption that has swept across the entire system, that quote-unquote liberal international order that dare not speak its name on Ohio campaign trails and the like. So I'll leave it there and look forward to a spirited conversation. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I appreciate it.
Jake has offered to take questions, so please raise your hand. We have microphones on the side or in back, or if you think you can speak loudly enough, then feel free to speak.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Alyssa. I'm a second year here. I wanted to press you a little bit on your point about corruption. I thought that was really interesting that you put it on par with working in alliances against cyber attacks, information operations, and counterterrorism. I'm wondering how you see that anti-corruption issues being operationalized, and how we can avoid seeing what we saw about a year ago, Saudi Arabia using corruption as a tool to basically imprison businessmen and seize assets. So how to avoid anti-corruption efforts to maybe empower authoritarian leaders and instead break that system down?
So if I had the operational answers to this, I promise you I would have been like out there writing on it, because I think part of the reason I raise it in this talk is what has traditionally happened with corruption is it gets assigned into the development space. Okay, so we have the real security issues over here, and then we have the soft stuff that people do over here, and corruption is one of them. I think people a few years ago started to recognize that particularly for state authoritarian systems, and Russia is probably the paramount case of this, but you see it in the Gulf, you see it in certain cases with the way that China operates with its neighbors as well. And potentially, this is a real potential threat for the Belt Road Initiative as we go forward too, that the use of these sort of corrupt kleptocratic networks to compromise not just economies, but political systems as well, of weaker, less transparent economies on the periphery of these larger actors that have a lot of money to throw around, that becomes a deep vulnerability. And I guess where I would start from the perspective of NATO, and the reason I believe corruption should be near the top of the agenda, is if you're thinking about the threat from Russia, yes, it accumulates in terms of nuclear weapons and a military modernization program and the like, but the actual threat to actual NATO members today is probably more coming through these networks of corruption in Bulgaria, in Hungary, in some of the other Eastern European allies, Montenegro, what have you. And figuring out both how you effectively work with those states to put economic reforms, necessary reforms around transparency and good governance and like into the security bucket, into the kind of, this is protecting your sovereignty and your way of life, and therefore is necessary not just because we think, it'd be nice to do the way we used to talk to you about IMF structural adjustment or EU accession requirements 20 years ago, but because this is really now fundamental to your national security. That should be a big piece of the puzzle. And similarly in Asia, working with a range of democratic actors who are committed to open government and transparency. And by the way, this is where states like India, Brazil, which has gone through a huge set of corruption scandals and where corruption now is at the top of the list for every election from Peru across the continent because of the ripple effects of the corruption in Brazil, that this is a global issue. So I guess what I would say is that if you, made it more of a leader level concern, not just shunt it off to be dealt with by the development experts when they get around to it. B, if you put it in the context of politics and security, so that you're trying to pursue reforms, not just because they're on the nice to-do list, but because they've moved over to the must-do list. And C, if you can also develop a set of sticks to go along with the incentives you're trying to offer your partners and other vulnerable states, but to say to the Russians, these are ways in which we can hold you accountable to the extent you're continuing down this road, and let's have a real conversation about what can be done here. I think this is a rich vein to mine for students, to think about the use of corruption as a geostrategic tool and how we are unprepared for it. And then also layering in what I think is a very necessary humility, how part of the reason we're unprepared for it is because our own system here in the United States, certainly, has too many features that for which these, kind of the nexus of corporate and political and other forms of power and the fact that, we dominate the world in terms of shell corporations and shell entities, and even this most recent tax reform bill is kind of filled with this kind of stuff, that like we are hardly, pure as the driven snow on this. So what do we have to do domestically to change our laws, including those shell corporation laws and beneficial ownership and other things like that, in order to make ourselves less susceptible to this kind of thing, I think is very important. I also think this is a political winner. And I don't say that to say, oh, so let's do it for that reason, but rather that if you want a durable, sustainable foreign policy that speaks to a mindset which says this has got to be connected to me and my life and my well-being, that being able to point out to people that this is a threat to working people the world over, that's got to be an important part of the message as well. So those are some initial thoughts, but I think I have more questions than answers on how exactly you go about doing this, but for me, I cannot underscore enough how central I think it is to a future national security strategy for basically any country seeking to be built along an open democratic and economic model. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. My name is Claire. I'm also a second year here. This is kind of a follow-on question to that. And thinking about kind of your vision for building back better, what do you see the role of development being vis-a-vis security and diplomacy? And kind of, do you think there's the necessary political and financial capital to be able to kind of execute that vision?
It's interesting. Every year, there's a poll done about how much of the U.S. budget is devoted to foreign aid, and people think it's like 25%, it's less than 1%. So there's a real gap in what people think is being applied and what actually is. But I don't actually think it's of much political salience. I mean, which is to say, if we doubled or tripled the foreign aid budget, I don't think you'd have a popular backlash necessarily. Donald Trump didn't really go down this road. I mean, he was much more interested in going after freeloading allies and trade agreements than really going after foreign aid. And in fact, among the things he's preserved within the system have been, and even enhanced, have been the global health investments and the global hunger investments through Feed the Future. I mean, PEPFAR is, has this kind of bipartisan basis. So I actually have less. What worries me about the future of U.S. development policy and Western development policy generally is less whether you can secure the resources if you have a highly motivated president who really wanted to make that a priority, and more, we don't know how to do it. We know how to do certain things. I think we're quite, the PEPFAR example is one of somewhat astonishing success on a very narrow issue of how you deal with a particular disease, but systemic reform of health, of overall health systems, or how to think about the orientation of economies to, produce greater and more widely shared growth. It's like, and particularly in the most weak, fragile, and failing states out there, our track record is really bad as a country. And I've read a lot of different diagnoses for why that is so. But it seems to me that until we can figure out how to actually take the learnings of the last 25 years and convert them bureaucratically into more effective application of foreign aid and all the tools of development, I'm nervous that we'll get someone, and on the Build Back Better, I'll just give you one example in this space that I think what has been exposed over time is the United States does not have any form of comprehensive development finance institution. Okay, we have OPIC, which you have to have a US nexus to get the investment. And then we have a credit authority within USAID, but it's quite limited. So unlike some of the other major donor nations, we don't think about how you mobilize investment and trade alongside aid in an integrated way and then have a vehicle to actually drive that. And it seems to me that one of the things to look at in terms of solving that problem that I just described is figuring out how you would create such an institution and then how you'd make it effective. But in general, I feel unsure-footed when it comes to thinking about how we take some of these massive challenges that we see, say, across the Sahel or in South Asia that are directly related to security and political challenges that come home to roost in a big way in Europe and even in the United States. It's like when I hear Europeans talking about their solution to the Sahel, for example, it's the same old stuff. And it's like, I'm just not confident that that's going to get us to where we need to go. But I don't have the answer, unfortunately, on what we do. I can say that's one place for the US on the Development Finance Institution that I would go. But in general, I don't see this as being a lack of political will. I see it as some kind of set of bureaucratic constraints around actually figuring out how we apply lessons learned in development effectively, and so we keep repeating the same mistakes. Yeah.
My name's Max. I'm a first year. Thanks for being here. Can you elaborate on your point about the difference between 2 more years of Trump versus 6 more years of Trump?
Yeah. I think right now, if you travel the world, there's a variety of reactions to Trump, which range from in Israel, just, total satisfaction, to in Europe, bewilderment and concern, to apathy in other places where folks are just like, well, we're moving on. But I think a common thread across much of the world, without being too generalizing, is that people are still asking themselves, even now 2 years in, is this an aberration or is this the new normal? Is this just kind of how the United States is going to be from here on out? And I think there's a little bit of a sense of we'll wait it out and sort of see, is there a correction here in 2020 or not? And I'll just tell a story along these lines. I was with Joe Biden in Singapore in, I guess, 2013, before Lee Kuan Yew passed away. We met with Lee Kuan Yew, and Biden, in his inimitable way, starts the conversation by saying, so, Lee, what are the Chinese up to? And I thought Lee would be like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean, what are they up to? But instead, without missing a beat, he says, oh, I'll tell you what they're up to. They're in America, and they're digging. And Biden said, what do you mean they're digging? He said, yeah, they're digging for the black box. They're trying to find the black box you buried. And Biden said, the black box? He said, yes, you're trying to find the black box that your country buried that contains the secret for how America can screw up and then figure out how to reinvent itself. Everybody wants that black box. Chinese are ready to go get it, And I remember it so well, especially now, because it still gives me some hope, this story, because I think there is a view out there, and the famous Winston Churchill line about the Americans doing every possible wrong thing before they finally get around to doing the right thing. There is a view that, okay, maybe they'll figure it out and come back, and while they don't just come back exactly as things were before, broadly speaking, we can get back on a more positive path. I think what happens if Trump gets reelected in 2020 is people just decide, okay, all right, so this is America, and we're in a just entirely different phase of America's role in the world, and therefore we need to restructure our expectations and our relationships more fundamentally as a result of that. And I don't think then 4 years later somebody gets to come along to the same extent and say, oh, just kidding. Not only was he elected, but he was reelected, after people had the chance to look at it for 4 years and say, yeah, we want 4 more years of that. So that is what I think is the difference between 1 term and 2 terms of Trump. I don't think it's the difference between 1x and 2x. It's rather 1x and 10x in terms of the way the world will look at these issues, both friends and competitors and adversaries. Now, this raises an obvious question, which is, okay, so let's say someone other than Trump is elected president in 2020. Well, who's to say that 4 years or 8 years later, you don't just get Trump, except even more extreme? Won't the world kind of look and say, yeah, okay, we'll take you back a bit, but we're watching you very closely? I think they will, and they'll be right to. because the odds that in fact America turns around and elects someone as bad or worse than Trump have gone way up. That is a distinct possibility. And I think if you work in American foreign policy, and one of the things that I did when I was in government was play a central role in launching the Iran negotiations and negotiating the Iran nuclear deal, which has now been set aside by the United States, is I think to myself, how am I going to look people in the eye if I go back into government in 2021 and say, oh yeah, let's get to work on another agreement that is not ever going to become a treaty in the Senate, but we'll agree it amongst ourselves. And on this is a long-winded answer to your question, by the way, but I'm just going to keep going. On this, the Paris Climate Agreement presents a really interesting model for me. Because I think what the US is going to have to do and what the rest of the world is going to demand of the US is that when we design or participate in the design of international arrangements going forward, there's going to have to be a kind of built-in flexibility for the presence and absence of the US. And Paris is a good example of this, that agreement can endure with strong participation by America, just not by our federal government right now. Because it is sufficiently flexible and malleable so that it can endure without one of the major emitters in the world being in it for a period of time. That can't go on forever. But one of the things that will be true that was not true in the transition from Bush to Obama, where much more was like, okay, Obama's here, this is going to be great. I don't think no matter who's elected, and if it's 2020 or 2024, that they get to just come in and say, back to business. It's going to be a more wary, a complex relationship with the international community writ large. I'm sort of generalizing here than it is right now. Yeah.
To kind of thinking about the global economic order, do you, as we have more globalized wealth distribution among countries, do you see Americans' influence kind of decreasing due to that fact? And if it is so, do you see our American role in leadership and global order similar to before, after World War II, or could it be different?
It will definitely be different than after World War II. I mean, after World War II, we were half the world's GDP, and our major competitors and adversaries were in ruins, Japan and Germany. And we could build a system, at least for the West, that was sort of built in our image. And then after '89, when the Soviet Union fell, it was a unipolar moment. I don't think a unipolar era in that sense, but a unipolar moment, where again we could design an update to that system in our own image. The basic bargain was always going to have to be revisited as other countries gained in strength and influence. My argument is it's being revisited. As we make each new determination about things from new plurilateral trade arrangements to the Paris Climate Agreement to the Iran deal to other significant efforts to deal with major global challenges, or the conversion from the G7, G8 to the G20, it's being renegotiated. And the reason I think this order is more resilient than people think is because we have been able to make this transition to a more sort of comprehensive system around a lot of these problem-solving issues without big formal institutions. It's been a little bit more informal, a little bit more flexible, the G20 or Paris or the Nuclear Security Summit to deal with loose nuclear materials or what have you. But that has not actually meant a substantial reduction in US activism or leadership up until Trump came along. It's meant a different kind of leadership, a kind of leadership that is about galvanizing cooperation and getting other countries, respecting their prerogatives, but getting them to step up and also play a part. I don't think that we are headed to a place where the US economy will become so on parity with so many other economies that we are going to lose the capacity to do that anytime soon, that form of leadership. And I'd make a couple of observations on that front. First, I'm skeptical that, for example, the dollar as the US reserve currency is in any substantial danger unless we get a complete decoupling of the US-China economies, which is the extreme version of where this trade war goes. But in the kind of base case, I don't see that under real threat. Number two, access to the US market remains an unbelievable source of leverage and influence for the United States. I would say much more so, actually, as we go forward than is true for China, where access to the Chinese market's a far more complicated proposition. And then number three, we entered this trade war between the US and China, a trade war that I think is completely ill-advised and kind of silly, with the global conventional wisdom being, boy, China's got all the cards, and America's, this isn't going to go so well for them. That was a year ago. To today, it's, SHIT, America has the cards, and China's hurting. I think people, because of the nature of rising powers versus established powers, people underestimated America's fundamental economic strength and maybe overestimated the capacity of China to sort of bend the US to its will in a way. That's not to say that China is not going to continue down a positive trajectory, but the US economic capacity, even in the face of enormous political turbulence, I think has been proven quite significantly over the past 15 years. And if you think about the possibility of demography, the innovation base, and all of the other advantages that the United States has, it doesn't feel to me like we're headed towards the kind of secular decline that became a little bit of the conventional wisdom post-financial crisis. Oh, one last thing, I would just tell a story about this. So I was with Hillary meeting with Angela Merkel in Berlin, and she had just met with Vladimir Putin a couple days before, and she was laughing because she tells this story. She says, Putin comes and sits down, I think this was like 2012-ish. It was relatively early days of the shale revolution. He says, Angela, don't believe the Americans when they tell you that they have all this oil and gas in their country. They're making it up. It's just completely made up. It's propaganda. And Angela Merkel says, I don't think that's true. But she says to Hillary, but it does seem kind of fanciful, I have to admit, like that you really have some magic technology that could turn you into the world's largest oil producer in like 5 years. From a conversation where it's like we're in an energy poverty situation. So she was kind of almost asking, like, are you making this up? And now, in 2018, the United States is the world's largest oil producer. Who saw that coming in 2008? So, to the point about the black box and the general residual strengths of this country, even in the face of the circus that we're dealing with right now, which is not all about Trump, it's about real fundamental failings in our democratic system. We're doing okay. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Neha. I'm a PhD candidate here. You talked about China as the rise of China as a meta change in how the world is changing. But I particularly want to ask you about China's embrace of 19th century mercantilism, and are you alarmed about it at all? And how do you think it's gnawing at this question about America's leadership in the world?
I'm quite concerned about it now. I'm also concerned about America's embrace of 19th century mercantilism, which has become the order of the day today. But when I referred to the possibility of a transatlantic, trans-Pacific trade arrangement that would try to create high standards across a range of different factors, not just typical trade liberalization and barriers, but along the lines of intellectual property, state-owned enterprises, currency, other ways in which state capitalist economies have the capacity to pull levers to their advantage and to the disadvantage of the open system, labor standards, other things. I had in mind essentially trying to present China with a choice, not an ultimatum. I think we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of competition turning into confrontation between the US and China, and I'm very nervous about that. And I'll say a word more about that in a second, but in direct answer to your question, I believe the idea should be if we can establish that kind of high standard platform and then say to the Chinese, essentially you are going to have to make some fairly fundamental reforms to the relationship between the government and the free market in your system as it relates to the way that you trade and invest in the rest of the world. That's not going to be an easy conversation, and we are going to have to accept a relatively long trajectory on it. But that, for me, would be the best outcome, because I think the situation as it exists today cannot persist in that I think there's just too much, for lack of a better term, unfairness baked into the distinction in models that it's going to become incompatible over time. Just more broadly on China, though, it's been amazing for me to watch from the day I walked into the State Department in 2009 to today, less than a decade. When I walked in the State Department in 2009, we were negotiating the words of the US-China partnership, which was a positive, cooperative relationship for the 21st century. It was like we spent like a month negotiating that tag. Okay. But it was really all about pushing this idea on both sides that this was going to be a fundamentally different type of established power, rising power relationship. It was going to work. We both had a stake in each other's success. Today, in the American strategic community, the idea is basically well baked in that we've screwed up. We got China wrong, and we let them get the drop on us. And they got the drop on us, and now we have only a short window of opportunity to get super competitive super fast, or else we're going to get our lunch eaten. And you can see this on the pages of Foreign Affairs and in a lot of other places, and it certainly has come home to roost in this administration's foreign policy, but I think a democratic foreign policy is going to look much the same way. And the problem I have with that approach is not to be clear-eyed about the challenges between our two countries and a lot of the differences that we have, but rather this is like, it's a recipe for, if all of a sudden it's just all competition all the time, and your presumption is not, as George Kennan's presumption was with the Soviet Union, that China's bound to collapse someday, so that competition will ultimately result, whenever it does, in one side collapsing. It's like competition to what end? Where's the end point, if not further escalation? That really makes me nervous. And so in a weird way, I've become, from early days in the administration where I was a little bit more robust in my view of how the US should deal with the US-China relationship, I've become a bit more cautious just watching how the pendulum has swung so hard on the issue. Yeah.
In order to, sorry, my name's Bo, I'm a second year student here. In order to rebuild and to address some of these issues you outlined today, there's a need to sell the public on some of these complex foreign policy issues that are being simplified in a really grievance-based narrative of how foreign policy is working. I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how to sell the American public on that.
I mean, starting where I finished on the last question, I think that part of the political challenge on the China front is that most people's answer to that question right now in the political quarters in Washington is our solution to all of our messaging problems is China. Okay? Just blame it on China. Like, everything we do in foreign policy, it's because we got to beat those guys. And that makes me nervous too, because then you're mobilizing people around something that, starts having its own logic. I will instead duck your question slightly, and the reason I'm going to duck it slightly is because I don't have a good answer. I haven't come up with a way, other than a great enemy, to really tell a story to the American people about why we've got to be so active and engaged in the world. I can point out all of these challenges that require multilateral cooperation. It's a mouthful. It's a mouthful. If you give me 5 minutes with someone, I think in plain spoken English, I could scare them about Ebola and ISIS and climate change and tell them, no, we got to, and financial ruin, and I could convince them, yeah, we got to work with others, good, and people would be like, sure, but that's not really a sustainable messaging strategy. So I guess what I would say instead, my honest opinion, is that the American people are not against an active, engaged global leadership role for the United States. They're ambivalent about it. If a president comes along and says, we're going to do this and this is going to be great, they'll generally go along with it because they'll be like, I can understand, I can see the logic for that. If a president comes along and says, we're getting screwed by all that and it's horrible and let's come home, we'll say, I can see the logic of that too. The only things that I believe are actually political, are just like no-go zones, are if the United States decided it wanted to start yet another war with a large number of ground troops in the Middle East, the American people would find a way to reject that. And don't try and pass a trade deal in an election year. Okay, I think TPP would have passed if it had come up in 2015 instead of 2016. And look, Trump produces the USMCA, and everyone's just like, okay, sure, why not? Yeah, fine. So I don't know that actually there are that many issues in respect to foreign policy where you cannot take the kind of approach I just laid out because the American people aren't quote unquote bought in. I'm not sold on that. Now, the reason that's a duck of your question is because in a good democracy, it should be more than relying on the ambivalence of people as the foundation of your work overseas. You should be seeking their active support and consent. But I don't know how to structure that national conversation in a way that actually gets people engaged. So if others have ideas, I'm all ears on them. But I do think, in general, there are only a few true guardrails, and those are places I don't think we should go anyway. So I feel like what I've laid out to you in terms of adjustments to our approach, while continuing to assert that, yes, we're going to have a positive sum mindset about the world, yes, we're going to be invested in other people's success and not just our own, that is not, just because Trump is taking the other side of that argument, it's not like he's being swept along by a wave of 60% of the country's popular support. NATO, people say countries should pay more for NATO, our allies should pay more for NATO. I want to say, like, yeah, other countries should pay more for NATO. If someone gets up and says, NATO's been awesome and Russia and China don't have NATO, people will say, yeah, NATO's awesome and Russia and China don't. So I think this ambivalence is probably the most powerful factor in foreign policy decision making. As long as you don't trigger a backlash because you do something really stupid, then the American people will invest in their leaders the faith that they can carry on a reasonably effective foreign policy. Yeah.
And my name is Alvin Hendrickson. I've taught diplomatic history here for many years. I'm very interested in your reflections on leadership and your suggestions about it. The idea of a leadership role, I mean, the term role comes from the theater. A role is something defined by the playwright, in a sense. It's not something that the leader, but maybe the leader does sort of fluidly make the role as he or she goes along. And my question is this. You used the word early on about distributing. Distributing, maybe even leadership. Can leadership be shifted from one country or one organization to another? But more pointedly, is it possible to work out somewhat in advance, in the absence of a well-defined organizational structure, who will take the lead in certain ways on certain subjects? I mean, in the Iran nuclear talks, for example, the U.S., I gather from what I read about it, I know you were involved in it, the U.S. dealt directly with the Iranians on the substance of the deal, basically. And Federica Mogherini sort of coordinated, the assent with China and Russia and the EU members. That possibly was fairly well defined, or it came to be defined. President Obama was said to have, not by himself, I've read Ben Rhodes' book, and this is discussed, he led from behind with regard to Libya. Whereas the French sort of jumped in early on, but the U.S. then provided logistical support. Our recent dean, Jim Stavridis, is very much involved in that.
Right.
So what are your thoughts about leadership? Is it something that can be shifted in certain ways, and can you calibrate in advance? I mean, can you make pre-commitments that we will do this, that Britain will handle Sierra Leone, for example? I mean, in Africa, I could imagine maybe more differentiation, whereas the U.S. might have a larger role in dealing with, say, a migration crisis that we're facing right now in Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, in part because of our regional proximity. Or do we have to sort of wing it in a way?
Yeah. I mean, in general, I think we have to wing it more than we can count on pre-commitments, in part because this may change over time, but as things stand right now, the natural alternative sources of leadership would be China and Europe, the European Union, or the major European actors right now. Now others could come to the fore, and for particular regional purposes, South Africa or Brazil or Mexico could play that role. But on the larger global issues, your natural alternative candidates, or your candidates for taking on part of the burden in any given thing are those. The problem is I have not seen, because of Europe's preoccupation and China's basic logic, which is for the moment we want to continue to operate on the backbone of the system the US is driving forward, and where we need to, we'll depart from it, and where we need to, we'll try to adjust it, but fundamentally, we're not stepping into the US role. They don't want to do that, and the Europeans really can't because of a preoccupation. That I think if you tried to pre-establish or pre-divide up who's responsible for what, at least on the larger global issues, it would not be a recipe for success. That in the end, the US, kind of by the laws of physics, at least for a while, would get pulled back into saying in any given case, okay, we're here. Now, we're not going to just do everything or tell everyone what they have to do, but we're essentially going to serve the role of distribution. And that will have to happen whether you're talking Ebola, or you're talking a financial crisis, or you're talking a security crisis somewhere. The only real area where I think that might not be true is on very specific regional issues. So, for example, the European Union has become rightly preoccupied with the Sahel, and they're developing an entire strategy around that, with the US not really participating all that much. Now, most of those countries are countries that are former colonial actors of the French or the British, so there's that particular relationship as well. And China, you know, the problem in Asia with China being that actor is that normally you're going to have at least one or two significant voices saying, we don't want the Chinese calling the shots on this issue, whether it's the Japanese, the Indians, or in the South China Sea context, the Vietnamese. So I'm biased, obviously. I spent years flying around in a plane with the United States of America on the side. I believe in our capabilities, and I'd rather have us in the proverbial driver's seat than others. And so I want to test my thinking on this. It may just be my bias talking, but I basically believe that for the foreseeable future, this is not merely a role the US has assigned to itself. We are not the playwright in this. It is a role that the US has, yes, assigned to itself, but other countries have also said, we'd rather assign it to you than the alternatives, which are nothing, or giving it to some other actor. And that basic bargain would have persisted, I think, for quite some time, despite changes in the international environment, with adjustments to the way the role is played. But for Trump, now it's a little more up in the air. But I guess the argument I'm making today is there's enough in those laws of physics that can get us back there if we can get beyond Trump. And if we can build better so that the manner in which we are approaching that leadership changes. And I'll just give you two more examples to make it a little more concrete. In the case of Iran, at the end of the day, while Mogherini and Cathy Ashton before her, you know, played a role in trying to essentially herd cats, as you were suggesting, the role of the United States in that was so singular and decisive that if you remove the US from the equation there just is no conceivable way of getting to a deal. I think the same thing is true on the Paris Climate Agreement, even though the Chinese role was fundamental as well. But if you remove the role of the United States there, it just doesn't happen. There's no mechanism by which you generate the forward motion, the momentum to propel a result. And that's where I'm having a hard time finding where that engine comes from if the US isn't the one driving it. If I haven't put enough different metaphors and similes into one answer to a question, I'm going to try to stick 3 or 4 more in. But those are some loose thoughts. It's a great question. And my thinking on it is more colored by experience than by analysis. And I'm now trying to figure out in this quieter period how to do the harder analysis that your question calls up to try and get to a better answer to it. Yeah.
Hello, I'm James. I'm a sophomore at Fletcher University. I was wondering where the proxy wars between Iran and Saudi Arabia fit into your view of a renewed U.S. Gulf Fleet?
Yeah, I didn't really talk much about that because I find it so difficult. And, you know, my basic analysis, this is a very crude analysis in the Middle East right now, is that over the past few years, you've had a circumstance in which the Iranians have suffered from overconfidence and a sense that we're on the make, we're on the come, everything's working in our direction, we're gonna double down in each of these different conflicts. And the Saudis have suffered, but fundamentally this is all proof of Iran's ascendancy, reclaiming its destiny in the region. And the Saudis and many of the other Sunni states have suffered from underconfidence, a sense of being under siege, of being abandoned, of, oh my God, the Iranians are coming. And that the overconfidence of the Iranians and the underconfidence of the Sunnis have each led them to act in deeply unproductive ways. And so, if that's a correct diagnosis, then from my perspective, the US role should be to try to address both sides of that equation. Now, this is pre-Khashoggi, because I think that's going to only reinforce some of the worst tendencies of the Saudis. But what I would say is that we need to provide some greater confidence to the Sunni states that the outcome of all of this is not pure Iranian domination of the region, and we need to dent Iran's confidence that we're not going to permit that to happen, but only for the purpose of structuring a negotiation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with some other actors as well, for them to figure out how they come to a modus vivendi. Now, I say this to people who work on the Middle East, and they just say, it'll never happen, it's crazy. It's like, if the US is not putting its shoulder on both sides behind that kind of outcome, an outcome that does not expel Iran from the Middle East, but also an outcome that doesn't just browbeat the Saudis into knuckling under, but rather tries to structure a negotiation that deals with these this underlying context, then we might as well just take our ball and entirely go home. That, to me, is the only long-term solution to the region, and it requires us to speak much more honestly about our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is deeply broken, and it requires us to speak much more honestly about our relationship with Iran, which at the moment is deeply counterproductive. So, I'm clear-eyed about the threats and aggression of this Iranian regime, both abroad and at home, but I also believe that it is an actor in the world that occupies a piece of real estate, and we got to deal with it. We got to deal with it in a way that is fundamentally practical, and we have not done that. And the way this administration is choosing to go about it, which is essentially a unilateral surrender strategy, I think is destined for failure. Have I talked you guys into submission, basically?
Well, we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. So maybe I'll pose one, since this talk is held under the auspices of the Russia and Eurasia program. You haven't talked much yet about Russia, which is interesting in part because it plays such a large role in 2016.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to hear you put that in the context of an overall Russia strategy for the United States going forward. How do you balance the concerns about domestic politics versus Russia's role in Eastern Europe and elsewhere?
Well, I'll start with my diagnosis of why Trump likes Russia so much. And yes, it's to do with the fact they helped him win the election and all that, and all the money they've given him, surely. But even if none of that had happened, I think Trump would really like Russia. Because Trump has two grievances. He hates allies who take advantage of us, and he hates countries who screw us over in trade. And Russia is not an ally of ours, and we don't really trade with Russia. So, therefore, you hear him say this a lot, he said it all through the campaign trail, why wouldn't we get along with Russia? When you add to that, they are a white Christian nation who also happens to not like Muslims, just like he doesn't like Muslims. I mean, come on, this is pretty great. So I sort of get that, and I do think that when he came in, the politics didn't really allow for it, but he and Bannon really had this vision of kind of the global north coming together to fight the two real enemies, the Chinese and the terrorists, and at the same time putting the Europeans in their place, collectively breaking up the European Union. There's something kind of weirdly symmetrical about this entire relationship. the issue has become toxic. It's become deeply tied into domestic politics. And I was a person who was a strong believer in the reset when we came in 2009, because I thought there were areas where we could work practically with the Russians and achieve real results. And we did. You know, the supply lines to our troops in Afghanistan, North Korea sanctions, Iran sanctions, New START treaty, Russia's accession to the WTO, etc. What I don't know now is whether it is possible to come up with something even remotely resembling a bargain with Russia. For example, if we said, look, we're taking NATO expansion off the table with respect to Ukraine and Georgia, we are going to recognize some of your fundamental interests, and in return, knock it off with the election interference in us and throughout the West, and work with us on a suitable, sustainable resolution in Syria. In theory, that all sounds great. In practice, is Putin even remotely interested in something like that? You would know better than I would, but my worry is that all of this, like the normal, rational American way of trying to deal with these things is, hey, gee whiz, we're gonna go solve this thing, we'll go sit down and figure it out, and here's the deal, and there's the deal. And at the end of the day, Putin's purposes, fundamentally driven by his desire for regime stability, require him to be engaged in a fundamentally disruptive, destabilizing strategy. And that he can't live in a world that involves this kind of grand bargain, because it necessarily reduces Russia's relative overall importance in the system, because their economy is, I guess, halfway between South Korea and Australia's at this point. The other thing that I think is really difficult about dealing with the Russians, and I saw this up close and personal during the Ukraine crisis, is as President Obama would call Putin up and say, okay, Vladimir, I want to get to an exit ramp on getting Russian troops out of eastern Ukraine. What do we have to do? Let's talk. NATO, EU, let's talk all of it. And Putin would say, we have no Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. What are you talking about? And Obama would be like, I'm looking at photos of units and tanks. I know, like, just knock it off. You can say that publicly, but it's just you and me talking. Like, how do we negotiate the end of this thing? Putin would be like, I literally don't know what you're talking about. Have you guys heard the song "It Wasn't Me" or "It Wasn't Me" by Shaggy? I mean, really, it like felt like that. Where you're like line by line, like, I see this, it wasn't me. You know, I see that, it wasn't me. Okay, how do you deal with deterrence, and how do you deal with resolution after you failed to deter, when you have this fundamental attribution problem and Putin is pursuing a strategy where he just kind of denies all of this sort of activity? How do you even get traction in a meaningful conversation on this kind of thing? We faced a similar challenge with China in respect to cyber-enabled economic espionage. And for years it was like, we don't do that, it never happens. And then in 2015 they actually struck a deal and it dropped meaningfully. We kind of worked through that. I'm less confident that we can work through it with Putin, because it feels to me structurally his incentives are in favor of doing this kind of stuff, which means in a sense that we are just in a game of containment and deterrence as much as possible. And that what we have to do is try to cabin the upside risk. I guess upside is a positive word. The escalation risk of this going non-linear. But otherwise, strengthening our core, focusing NATO on the kinds of things I described, which get at the Russia threat more than anything else, on cyber and corruption and counter-propaganda. And then where we can, trying to tamp down the worst impulses of him to play a disruptive and destabilizing role. But otherwise, I somewhat despair at actually working out a meaningful modus vivendi with the Russians. And I think another reset from another US president is not only not in the offing because for political reasons, because I think the American people probably would, especially if it wasn't someone who was accused of having, been elected by them, would probably go along with, hey, let's see if we can work this out. I think it's much more to do with the fact that whoever the next president is going to look at this and say, I don't see that as a plausible path, so I'm just going to try and manage it as best I can. It's not a particularly rigorous answer, but I think that's likely to be how things play out. And then the other aspect of this that's quite interesting is the Russia-China dynamic. and for all of you to think about. I mentioned in my talk that everyone from Bernie Sanders across the political spectrum now is kind of starting to coalesce around this argument that there has to be a free world component to America's grand strategy. That, you know, there are these big authoritarian actors who are not just playing defense anymore, they're playing offense. And in order to make, you know, to increase their own breathing space for their regimes, they are exporting authoritarianism elsewhere. And they have a common cause in this. Maybe they're not totally working together, but they have common cause in this. Whether you buy that diagnosis or not is really fundamental to how you decide you set your strategy. And I don't have a good answer yet as to the view either in Beijing or the Kremlin on that question, or how they respond if America begins going down the free world road, and then what the back and forth on that is. But I think it's a very interesting issue, and the Russia-China condominium problem for U.S. grand strategy and for our allies is a real one that I don't think currently we have a very good answer to.
Well, now that we've made it from Saudi Arabia to Shaggy, I think we can safely say we've covered all of our bases. So please join me in thanking Jay for a very interesting discussion.